As we discussed earlier, the correct answer to a weakening question must be a statement that, if true, makes the argument weaker. But what exactly does that mean? Well, remember that an argument asserts that this particular premise or set of premises will necessarily entail this particular conclusion. So anything that breaks that connection will weaken the argument. One way to do this would be to show that one or all of the premises are false. For example, if your friend argues that his professor for Scandinavian Literature 101 must be biased against him since she gave him a C on the final exam, one way to weaken this argument would be to say that there was a mix-up. Actually, he didn't really get a C, he got an A+. That would be an instance of falsifying the premise of the argument. But that's something that the LSAT almost never does, because that method of weakening doesn't require a test taker to engage with the logical gaps in the argument. That's why a far more common way to weaken an argument on the LSAT is to show that even though the premises might be true, that they nevertheless don't prove the conclusion. As you know by now, the missing pieces required for the argument to prove the conclusion are called assumptions. And since we're trying to weaken the argument, the best and by far the most common way is to falsify or cast doubt on one of the assumptions. So in our Scandinavian Lit example, we'd want to attack your friend's assumption that the only reason he could have gotten a C was the professor's bias against it. So you'd weaken your friend's argument by pointing out that he was hungover when he took the exam, which suggests that there's another explanation. Or you'd weaken the friend's argument by pointing out that there was blind grading on the exam, so the professor couldn't know which final was his. That would make the bias explanation for his grade implausible and unlikely. Remember that you don't need to completely destroy the possibility of the conclusion being true in order to weaken the argument. It's still theoretically possible that the professor is biased against your friend, but we've provided reasons to believe that that doesn't have to be true merely from the fact that he got a C on the final exam. Any answer choice that would make the conclusion less likely to follow from the premises will weaken the argument. To solve a weakened question, we'll follow all the same steps for strengthened questions, but now we'll look to counter assumptions in the argument. So first, identify the conclusion and the premises. Second, identify assumptions. Remember, if you're having a lot of trouble identifying assumptions in the argument, think about why the conclusion doesn't have to be true based on the premises. How would you criticize the argument? That can help get us on the right track to identifying what the argument's assuming. The third step is to anticipate things that would falsify or cast doubt on those assumptions. Then and only then should we go to the answer choices. Note that on weakened questions, like strengthened questions, they'll frequently present arguments that assume a causal relationship between things that aren't necessarily causally related. What can tip us off is a conclusion with causal language. When we're faced with this type of argument, we'll keep in mind the three common ways to weaken a causal relationship. Show an alternate cause or explanation, provide an example of the same cause without the same effect, or an example of the same effect but without the same cause. All the wrong answer choices to weaken questions will either be irrelevant or they'll actually strengthen. For example, in the Scandinavian Lit case, if an answer said that your friend sat in the front of the class, that would be irrelevant because it doesn't help us argue that the professor was or was not biased. And if an answer said that the professor doesn't like to see people with man buns excel academically, which is the exact hairstyle your friend has, that would actually support his argument that she was biased against him. In fact, answers that strengthen are often sucker choices because they have a clear effect on the conclusion, but they're just doing the opposite of what we want. When you're trying to eliminate an answer choice, remember to ask yourself, if this is true, does it make the conclusion less likely? A wrong answer will either have no effect on that conclusion, or it might actually make the conclusion more likely to be true. And keep in mind that the correct answer will be the one that helps us show the conclusion doesn't have to follow from the premises. Almost always, this will take the form of falsifying or casting doubt on an assumption.